The headless corpses of Weston and Brereton were dumped into cheap wooden boxes, bringing their days of debauchery alongside Henry VIII to a bitter, ignoble close. Their blood was spilled merely to clear the way for the king's next step, making them perhaps the most wretched victims of the entire Tudor era. Their lives were severed with such sudden brutality that the sheer horror of the reality was impossible to ignore. They didn't die because they were villains. They died because they were pawns marked for destruction. The king needed their blood to sell the lie of the queen's adultery, so they were dragged out and butchered by the machinery of the state. It was a wrongful, bitter end that exposed the naked truth of court politics. It is a place where friendship isn't worth a single penny when stacked against the preservation of power. The executions of Sir Francis Weston and Sir William Brereton in 1536 were not accidental tragedies. They were part of a deliberate, cold-blooded political purge designed to restructure the government. These men were not just collateral damage of a jealous husband. They were specific targets in a ruthless plan. Their deaths exposed the machinery of terror that was operating silently behind the velvet and gold of the Tudor court. To understand why they died, we must understand how the atmosphere at court had fundamentally shifted. The king himself had changed. In January 1536, Henry VIII was crushed by his horse during a joust at Greenwich. He remained unconscious for 2 hours, a period of time that terrified his counselors. The patient, athletic Renaissance prince was gone, replaced by a paranoid tyrant in constant physical pain from ulcerated legs. This injury likely caused significant frontal lobe brain damage, making him prone to sudden violent outbursts and stripped him of his former empathy. The crisis deepened when Anne Boleyn miscarried a male child on the very day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral. Henry viewed this not as a biological tragedy, but as a theological verdict. He saw it as a sign from God that his second marriage was as cursed as his first. With Catherine dead, Henry was legally free to marry a third time without the political baggage of a living ex-wife. He began to claim with chilling conviction that he had been tricked into the marriage by witchcraft, a claim that turned his wife from a partner into a monster in his mind. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and the architect of the break with Rome, seized this opportunity to save his own career. He viewed Anne and her faction as an obstacle to England's diplomatic alliances with the Holy Roman Empire. To destroy her completely, a simple annulment was not enough. He needed a capital crime. He fabricated a conspiracy of adultery and treason, a narrative so shocking that it would justify the total elimination of the Boleyn circle. But a conspiracy requires conspirators. Cromwell needed to find specific men he could accuse of being her lovers. Cromwell targeted the Privy Chamber, the king's private inner circle. Men like Weston held great power because they controlled physical access to the king. They decided who could speak to him, who could present petitions, and who was barred at the door. Cromwell viewed them as a rival political faction. By arresting the king's minions, Cromwell aimed to break their influence forever. He wanted to prove to Henry that even his closest friends, the men he laughed with and gambled with, were actually traitors plotting his humiliation. This coup proved that being close to the king offered no protection. In fact, it increased the danger. Sir Francis Weston was a favorite of the king and a key member of the establishment, yet he was destroyed instantly. His arrest sent a chilling message to the entire court. In this new violent era, being the king's friend was not a shield, it was a target. Sir Francis Weston embodied this dangerous proximity. He was not an outsider scraping for favor. He was the definition of the establishment. Born in 1511, Weston was the only son of Sir Richard Weston, a titan of the Tudor civil service. Sir Richard had served Henry VII and seamlessly transitioned to serving Henry VIII, surviving the falls of Wolsey and More. He was the governor of Guernsey and the under-treasurer of the Exchequer. Sir Richard was the kind of man who survived, prudent, wealthy, and fiercely ambitious for his son. He placed Francis at court at a young age, ensuring he was embedded in the royal household like a tick. Francis Weston grew up in the glow of the crown. He was handsome, athletic, and possessed the effortless charm of the very rich. By 1532, he was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. This role required him to be in the king's presence constantly. He slept in the king's room on a trundle bed to be available at night. He helped the king dress in the morning. He saw the king naked, vulnerable, sick, and angry. This level of intimacy breeds a dangerous type of familiarity, a false sense of equality that would prove fatal. The accounts of the privy purse, the king's personal checkbook, reveal the nature of their friendship. It was a relationship built on competitive play. Henry VIII was a man who needed to be entertained, and Weston was the consummate entertainer. They played tennis for hours at Hampton Court and Whitehall. They wagered heavily on archery. They played Imperial, a card game popular at court, involving complex betting strategies. The records show a one-way flow of money from the king to Weston. Henry lost frequently, or perhaps he allowed Weston to win. There are entries of £46, £20, sums that represented years of wages for a common laborer, being handed over to Weston after a single game of dice. It is easy to see how this distorted Weston's reality. When you are 20 years old and the most powerful man on earth is handing you fortune after fortune, laughing at your jokes and inviting you into his private sanctuary, you begin to believe you are invincible. You begin to believe that the rules of gravity do not apply to you. Weston was a minion. This term, often used derisively by the older nobility, referred to the younger favorites who mimicked the king's dress and mannerisms. They were an extension of Henry's own ego. Henry looked at Weston and saw a reflection of his own lost youth, vigorous, sporting, and desirable. He loved Weston because Weston made him feel young, but Weston had a flaw that would prove fatal. He was a narcissist. He was a married man. He had wed Anne Pickering, a wealthy heiress in 1530, but he lived as if he were a bachelor. He barely saw his wife, leaving her in the country while he played at court. Instead, he spent his time and his money on his appearance and his courtly flirtations. He was a peacock. He invested heavily in his wardrobe, knowing that in the Tudor court, clothes were power. To be seen in the latest French fashion was to prove one's relevance, and Weston was always the best-dressed man in the room. His behavior toward women was aggressive and entitled. He engaged deeply in the game of courtly love. This medieval concept had evolved into a dangerous pastime at the Tudor court. It involved a man pledging his service to a high-ranking woman, usually the queen or her ladies, and performing acts of devotion. He would write poetry, wear her colors, and sigh over her beauty. Theoretically, it was platonic. It was supposed to be a sophisticated game of manners. But in the claustrophobic, overheated atmosphere of the royal apartments, the line between the game and reality was often blurred, and Weston enjoyed blurring it. Weston was not just flirting for fun. He was flirting for status. To be seen as the servant of a prominent woman raised his own standing. He pursued Madge Shelton, the Queen's cousin, and alleged mistress of the king. He pursued other ladies of the chamber. He was playing a high-stakes game of social climbing, using romance as the ladder, unaware that the rungs were breaking. The tragedy of Francis Weston is that he did not realize the game had changed. He was still playing by the rules of 1532, where the king was happy and the queen was secure. He did not see that in 1536, the king was looking for a reason to destroy the queen. Weston's casual gallantry, his late-night conversations, his whispered jokes, all of this ammunition was being silently gathered by Thomas Cromwell's spies. While Weston represented the soft, decadent underbelly of the court, Sir William Brereton represented something entirely different. If Weston was the king's plaything, Brereton was the king's enforcer. Brereton's inclusion in the list of the condemned has always puzzled historians who look only at the surface. He was not part of the young poetic circle. He was born around 1487, making him nearly 50 years old in 1536. He was an old man by Tudor standards. He had served the king for decades. He was not known for his dancing or his lute playing. He was known for ruthlessness. Brereton was the tycoon of Cheshire. While he held the title of Groom of the Privy Chamber, his true power base was in the northwest of England. Cheshire and the Welsh Marches were wild, lawless territories. They were far from London, full of feuding gentry and violent crime. To govern them, the king needed a strong hand, a man who could intimidate the local warlords. Brereton was that hand. He accumulated offices with a rapacious hunger. He was the sheriff of Flint, the escheator of Cheshire, the ranger of the forests. Every title brought income and influence. He controlled the courts in Cheshire. If you were a distinct enemy of William Brereton, you did not get justice. If you were his friend, you could get away with murder. There are records of Brereton intervening to stop legal proceedings against his retainers. He was a classic corrupt official, running a protection racket under the guise of royal administration. His income was astronomical. While Weston relied on the king's gambling losses and his father's allowance, Brereton was independently wealthy. He was earning over £1,300 a year from his various lands and offices. This wealth made him a threat. In the eyes of Thomas Cromwell, Brereton was a relic of the past. Cromwell was a centralizer. He wanted all power to flow from the king and council, not to be hoarded by local magnates. Brereton ran Cheshire like a personal fiefdom. He was an obstacle to the administrative revolution Cromwell was implementing. The question then arises, how did this aging, corrupt administrator get tied into a sex scandal with the Queen? The answer lies in political convenience. Cromwell needed to widen the net. If he only accused the young, handsome men like Weston and Norris, the story might look like a simple case of youthful indiscretion. By including Brereton, a powerful older man, Cromwell added a sinister depth to the conspiracy. It suggested that the Queen's depravity knew no bounds, that she was not just seeking love but power. It also allowed Cromwell to liquidate a major political rival in the process. Brereton had enemies everywhere. The local gentry in Cheshire hated him. He had spent 30 years bullying his neighbors, seizing land, and manipulating the law. When the signal went out that Brereton was vulnerable, the complaints came flooding in. But Cromwell didn't charge him with corruption. Corruption was hard to prove and might implicate the king who had allowed it. Adultery with the Queen was a swift, absolute death sentence that required no complex legal arguments about land rights. So we have our two primary targets: Weston, the arrogant youth who thought he was the king's brother, and Brereton, the corrupt warlord who thought he was untouchable in his northern stronghold. They were moving through the spring of 1536, completely unaware that the ground was dissolving beneath them. The catalyst for the final explosion was the May Day joust, but the fuse had been lit days earlier. On April 24th, the king signed a commission creating a special Oyer and Terminer court to investigate treason. This was the legal gun being cocked. Cromwell had his spies, specifically women in the Queen's household like Lady Rochford, and perhaps even the Lady Worcester, listening at keyholes. They were listening for light conversation. In the Tudor world, speech was actionable. To predict the king's death was treason. To discuss the king's sexual potency was treason. And the Queen's ladies, bored and terrified, were talking. They were talking about how the king couldn't satisfy the Queen. They were talking about which courtiers were in love with her. And Francis Weston, in his infinite stupidity, provided the transcript. The encounter between Anne Boleyn and Francis Weston a few days before the arrests is one of the most vividly recorded moments of the entire tragedy. It took place in the Queen's apartments. The tension was already high. Anne was seeing the king spend more and more time with Jane Seymour. She was terrified of being replaced. She needed loyalty. She needed her party to close ranks. She saw Weston flirting with Mad Shelton. To Anne, this was a distraction she couldn't afford. She needed Weston's focus on her, on protecting her interests, not playing games with her cousin. She confronted him. "You neglect your wife," she told him. This was rich coming from Anne, but she was desperate. She accused him of leading Madge on. Weston, perhaps drunk, perhaps just high on his own ego, pushed back. He smiled at the Queen. He engaged in the bantering that had served him so well for 5 years. He told her that Madge Shelton was not the reason he came to her chambers. "Then why?" Anne asked. Weston dropped the bomb. "I love one in your house better than them both." Anne, likely freezing, asked, "Who is that?" "It is yourself," Weston replied. Silence. In that second, the world changed. Weston had just verbally committed adultery with the Queen of England. He had professed romantic love for the wife of Henry VIII. Anne knew instantly how dangerous this was. She rebuked him. She tried to shut it down, but the words were out. And in a court riddled with spies, words had wings. This conversation was reported to Cromwell. For the secretary, it was the smoking gun. It didn't matter if Weston meant it as a joke. It didn't matter if it was just courtly fluff. It was a confession. Cromwell could take "it is yourself" and twist it. He could claim it wasn't a declaration of unrequited love, but a reference to a criminal intimacy that had already occurred. While Weston was sealing his fate with words, Brereton was being destroyed by paper. Cromwell was compiling dossiers. He was digging up every grudge, every lawsuit, every complaint from Cheshire. He was building a profile of a man out of control. The accusation against Brereton would be less specific than Weston's. He would be accused of soliciting the Queen in November 1533 at Hampton Court, and succeeding later that month. The dates were fabrications. In November 1533, Anne Boleyn was dealing with the aftermath of her coronation and the early infancy of Elizabeth. The idea that she was sneaking William Brereton into her bed is ludicrous. But the truth was irrelevant. The narrative was what mattered. The narrative was that the Queen was a monster of lust, and these men were her enablers. As April turned to May, the trap was ready. The king was fully briefed. Henry's role in this is often debated. Did he believe the charges, or did he just want them to be true so he could be free? The ferocity of his reaction suggests a man who convinced himself of his own victimhood. He decided that these men, his friends and servants, were not just traitors. They were personal betrayers. They had laughed at him. They had cuckolded him. The love he bore them turned to a hatred that was absolute. The festivities of May Day 1536 began with a joust. Henry and Weston were there. It was the last time the old world existed. The king abruptly left the joust, taking a small boat to Westminster, leaving the Queen behind. The signal had been given. The following morning, the arrests began. Mark Smeaton, the musician, had already been taken and tortured. He had given names. He had named the gentlemen. The dominoes were falling. The arrest of a low-born musician might have seemed like a contained scandal, but it was merely the spark for a much larger conflagration. The shift from suspicion to total destruction was instantaneous. Thomas Cromwell did not offer these men a standard legal proceeding with summons and hearings. He offered them a blitzkrieg. As the sun rose on May 2nd, the trap snapped shut. The speed of the collapse was designed to induce paralysis, ensuring that by the time the accused realized they were in danger, they were already doomed. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London by barge. She arrived in broad daylight, a public spectacle that signaled the end of the old order. But for the men of the Privy Chamber, the terror was just beginning. They were left in a vacuum of information. Was the king merely punishing his wife? Was this a temporary estrangement? Sir Francis Weston remained at liberty for 2 days after the Queen's arrest. Those 48 hours must have been a psychological torture of the highest order. He continued his duties. He attended the king. He likely tried to gauge Henry's mood, looking for the warmth and affection that had been there only days before. But the king he faced now was a stranger. Henry had walled himself off, his heart hardened by the conviction that he was the victim of a monstrous betrayal. When Weston looked into the king's eyes during those final days, he would have seen only a cold, terrifying blankness. The axe fell on May 4th. Weston and Sir William Brereton were arrested on the same day. There was no fanfare. One moment they were free men of high standing. The next, they were prisoners of state. They were transported to the Tower of London, passing under the grim archway of Traitor's Gate. The transition was absolute. They went from the velvet warmth of the royal apartments to the damp stone cold of the fortress. The Tower of London in 1536 was already crowded with the debris of the Boleyn faction. Mark Smeaton, the musician, was there, broken and weeping in irons. Henry Norris, the groom of the stool, and the most senior of the accused, was there, maintaining a dignified, horrified silence. George Boleyn, the Queen's brother, was pacing his cell. When Weston and Brereton arrived, the cast was complete. The interrogation phase began immediately. We do not have transcripts of what was said to Weston and Brereton in those dark rooms, but we know the methods of the Tudor state. They would have been separated. They would have been told that others had already confessed. They would have been told that the king knew everything. For Weston, the shock was likely catatonic. He was 25 years old. He had never faced genuine hardship in his life. He was a creature of comfort, used to soft beds and deferential servants. Now he was facing the king's council, men he had known socially, men who had laughed at his jokes, who were now looking at him as a dead man walking. They would have confronted him with his own words. "I love you more than them both." They would have twisted his banter into treason. For Brereton, the interrogation would have been different. He was a hardened operator. He knew how the law worked because he had manipulated it for decades in Cheshire. He would have recognized immediately that the specific charges, adultery on dates when the Queen was pregnant, were nonsense. But he also would have recognized that the facts were irrelevant. He knew he was being purged. His interrogation likely focused less on the romance and more on establishing a web of corruption that Cromwell could use as leverage. While the men sat in their cells, the families outside were fighting a desperate losing battle. The reaction of the Weston family is one of the most poignant chapters of this tragedy. Sir Richard Weston, Francis's father, was a man of immense influence, but he found every door closed to him. In a panic, the family mobilized their entire fortune. They understood that Henry VIII was a man who loved money. They drafted a proposal that is staggering even to modern eyes. They offered the king 100,000 marks to spare Francis's life. To understand the scale of this offer, one must look at the economy of 1536. A skilled craftsman might earn £10 a year. 100,000 marks was a ransom that could fund a war. It was an offer to liquidate the entire Weston legacy, to bankrupt the family for generations, just to buy the breath of one young man. Henry VIII refused. This refusal is the definitive proof that the executions were not about justice, nor were they about the king's greed. They were about the king's ego. To accept the money would be to admit that the crime was transactional. Henry needed the world to believe that he was purging a moral rot. He needed blood, not gold. Even international diplomacy failed. Francis I, the King of France, wrote to Henry. The French court knew Weston well. He had been a Francophile, dressing in the French style and advocating for the French alliance. Francis III asked for clemency. Henry ignored his brother king. The decision had been made. The golden boy was to be discarded. On Friday, May 12, 1536, the four commoners, Weston, Brereton, Norris, and Smeaton, were brought to Westminster Hall for trial. It was a show trial in the purest sense. The jury was handpicked. It consisted of 12 men, many of whom were connected to the king's household or were known enemies of the Boleyns. The verdict was written before the prisoners even entered the hall. The charges were read aloud. The absurdity of the dates was glossed over. The prosecution painted a picture of a queen who was insatiable and a group of men who were traitorous leechers. Mark Smeaton, the low-born musician, pleaded guilty. He likely believed that a confession was his only route to a quick death, sparing him the full horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Weston, Brereton, and Norris stood firm. They pleaded not guilty. Weston looked at the jury. He must have recognized faces in the crowd. These were men he had played tennis with. These were men who had sought his favor weeks ago. Now they avoided his gaze. The atmosphere in Westminster Hall was suffocating. The air was thick with the realization that the king could reach out and crush anyone, regardless of their station. The trial was swift. The jury retired and returned almost immediately. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of high treason. The sentence pronounced by the Duke of Norfolk was the medieval nightmare. The men were to be taken back to the Tower, drawn on hurdles through the streets to Tyburn, hanged until half dead, cut down, their bowels cut out and burned before their eyes, and their bodies quartered. Back in the Tower, the reality of death settled in. It is here, in the shadow of the scaffold, that we see the true character of Francis Weston emerge. Stripped of his silks, his gambling, and his arrogance, he was just a frightened young man worrying about his soul. We have a letter, or rather a list, that he wrote in his final days. It is not a poem. It is not a defense. It is a remembrance of debts. In the Catholic theology of the time, to die in debt was to endanger one's passage to heaven. And Weston, terrified of hell, spent his final hours desperately trying to balance his ledger. The resulting list is both mundane and heartbreaking. 40 shillings to his cousin Dingley, £15 to the embroiderer, and £5 to a draper in London. Then came the most crushing entry of all, £46 to the king's grace. Even as Henry VIII was sharpening the axe, Weston was worried about paying him back for a gambling loss. It speaks to the psychological hold the king had over these men. To the very end, Weston saw himself as the king's servant. He did not curse Henry. He tried to settle his account with him. He signed the document, "By me, a great offender to God." There is no record of Brereton writing such a list. Brereton was a man of the borders. He likely spent his final hours in stoic silence or in prayer, preparing for the physical ordeal of death. He knew the game was lost. He had lived by the sword, and he was prepared to die by the axe. On May 17th, the sentence was commuted. The king, in a grim act of mercy, granted them the privilege of the axe rather than the rope and knife. They would be beheaded on Tower Hill. The morning was cold. A massive crowd had gathered. Public executions were the cinema of the Tudor age, and the execution of the king's own favorites was a blockbuster event. The 5 men, Weston, Brereton, Norris, Smeaton, and George Boleyn, were led out of the fortress. They climbed the wooden scaffold. The sawdust was fresh. The block was waiting. George Boleyn went first, delivering a long, passionate speech that nearly turned the crowd against the king. Then it was Norris, and then Francis Weston stepped forward. He looked out at the sea of faces. He was pale, gaunt, a shadow of the athlete who had dominated the tennis courts. He did not protest his innocence. To do so would be to call the king a liar and risk the confiscation of his family's property. He had to play the game one last time. I had thought to have lived in abomination yet this 20 or 30 years and then to have made amends, he told the crowd. It was a confession of a wasted life, not a treasonous one. He was telling them that he had planned to sin while he was young and repent when he was old. But death had come early. He warned the crowd not to trust in their youth or their favor. He was the moral lesson embodied. He knelt. He was blindfolded. The executioner raised the axe, one stroke. The golden boy was gone. Then came William Brereton. He was the oldest of the group. He stepped over the blood of the men who had gone before him. His speech was a masterclass in ambiguity. The cause whereof I die, judge not, but if you judge, judge the best. It was a challenge. He was refusing to validate the lies told about him, but he was also refusing to attack the king. He left the truth in the hands of God. He knelt, and the Tycoon of Cheshire was ended. The bodies were stripped. The heads were not displayed on London Bridge, as was custom for traitors. Perhaps the king could not bear to see the faces of his former friends rotting on spikes. Instead, the heads and trunks were gathered up and unceremoniously dumped into the ground in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. They were buried in the same crowded earth that would receive Anne Boleyn 2 days later. In death, they were finally, truly the Queen's men. While the physical destruction of Sir Francis Weston and Sir William Brereton was complete by noon on May 17, 1536, the destruction of their reputations was solidified by a calculated judicial fiction. To understand the true horror of this event, we must look past the blood on the fresh straw and examine the impossible lies written into the official records. It is in the dry, dusty indictments of the Tudor court that the true horror of this event is revealed, not as a crime of passion, but as a crime of bureaucracy. When we examine the Baga de Secretis, the bag of secrets which held the official records of the trial, we find the specific machinery of the frame-up. The indictments against Weston and Brereton were specific, detailed, and almost entirely fabricated. They were accused not of vague treason, but of specific acts of adultery committed on specific dates. And it is here that the case falls apart under the slightest historical scrutiny. Francis Weston was accused of having carnal knowledge of the Queen on 4 specific occasions: May 20th, June 20th, and June 24th in 1534, and again in 1535. These dates were not chosen at random. They were selected to create a pattern of long-standing infidelity. However, a cross-reference with the royal itinerary, the daily log of where the king and queen were located, exposes the lie. On the dates in June 1534, when Weston was alleged to be sleeping with the Queen at Hampton Court, Anne Boleyn was, in fact, visibly pregnant and often sick. She was under constant medical supervision. The idea that a queen, heavily monitored by doctors and ladies-in-waiting, could sneak a prominent courtier like Weston into her bedchamber without detection is logistically impossible. Furthermore, during some of the alleged dates, the court was on the move, and the Queen was lodging in chambers that lacked the privacy required for such an affair. The charges against William Brereton are even more ludicrous. He was accused of soliciting the Queen on November 16, 1533 at Greenwich, and sleeping with her on November 27. In November 1533, Anne Boleyn had just given birth to Elizabeth. She was in the period of confinement, a ritual seclusion, where she was surrounded exclusively by women. No man, not even the king, was permitted into the inner sanctum of the Queen's confinement chamber during this period. For Brereton to have accessed her in November 1533, he would have had to walk past a dozen guards and a room full of ladies-in-waiting into a room sealed off by religious and medical custom. Why, then, did Thomas Cromwell choose these impossible dates? Why build a case that was so easily disproven? The answer reveals the cynicism of the Tudor justice system. Cromwell knew that the dates did not matter. He knew that the jury at Westminster Hall was not there to weigh evidence. They were there to deliver a verdict that the king demanded. In a treason trial, the accused were not allowed defense counsel. They were not allowed to see the evidence beforehand. Weston and Brereton stood in the dock hearing these dates read out for the first time. They had no diaries, no access to the royal itinerary to prove their alibis. They were blindsided. Even if they had shouted, "But the Queen was in childbed then," the court would have overruled them. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The trial was merely a piece of theater to legitimize the execution. There is another figure lurking in the shadows of this case, a figure who connects the fate of these men to the ultimate betrayal. That figure is Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. She was the wife of George Boleyn and a lady of the Queen's bedchamber. History has often cast her as the villain, the wicked wife who provided the testimony that condemned her husband and his friends. It is highly probable that the specific details used to frame Weston, the light conversation, the jokes, the familiarity, came from Lady Rochford or women like her. The Tudor court was a surveillance state. The women of the bedchamber were the eyes and ears of the king. When Cromwell needed dirt, he squeezed these women. They were likely threatened with their own destruction if they did not speak. Lady Rochford, caught in the middle of the Boleyn collapse, may have offered up the names of Weston and Brereton to save herself. She knew who the Queen favored. She knew who made the Queen laugh. By turning innocent flirtation into evidence of treason, she provided Cromwell with the ammunition he needed. The tragedy of Weston and Brereton also serves as a dark mirror to the survival of others. They were not the only men arrested. Sir Thomas Wyatt, the greatest poet of the age and a former admirer of Anne Boleyn, was also thrown into the Tower. He watched the executions from his cell window, writing a poem that captures the sheer terror of the moment. "These bloody days have broken my heart." Why did Wyatt survive while Weston and Brereton died? Wyatt was just as close to the Boleyns. He had known Anne longer. The difference lay in politics and family connections. Wyatt was protected by Cromwell, who admired his intellect and utility. Weston and Brereton, however, were expendable. Weston was a minion, a symbol of the frivolous court Henry wanted to erase. Brereton was a political obstacle. Their deaths were necessary not because of what they had done, but because of what they represented. The execution of these men marked the death of courtly love in England. Before 1536, the English court was a place of romance, chivalry, and playful interaction between the sexes. Men wrote sonnets to ladies they could never have. They wore tokens on their sleeves. It was a game of fantasy. After May 17, 1536, the game was over. The execution of Francis Weston proved that the language of love could be translated into the language of treason. To tell a queen I love you was no longer a gallant compliment, it was a death warrant. The atmosphere of the court chilled instantly. Men became guarded. The free-flowing intimacy of the privy chamber was replaced by a paranoid caution. The minions were disbanded or disciplined. The king, once the ringleader of the revels, became a brooding, distant figure watching his courtiers for the slightest sign of betrayal. The impact of these judicial murders reverberated far beyond the silent, terrified corridors of the English court. While the immediate shock paralyzed London, the news of the Purge traveled across the Channel, dismantling Henry VIII's reputation among the princes of Europe. The execution of the Privy Chamber was not just a domestic tragedy, it was a diplomatic catastrophe that redefined the king from a Renaissance prince into a figure of unpredictable terror. The slaughter of his own inner circle signaled to the world that Henry VIII had crossed a line from monarch to monster. When the diplomatic couriers rode out of London in May 1536, they carried dispatch bags heavy with horror. In Paris, the news was received with genuine disbelief. King Francis I of France knew Francis Weston personally. Weston had been part of the embassy to France. He spoke the language, he dressed in the French style, and he was considered a friend of the French crown. For the French king to hear that his brother Henry had beheaded Weston was interpreted as a sign of madness. The Bishop of Faenza, the papal nuncio in France, wrote a letter that captured the mood. He reported that the English king was now widely viewed as a man full of suspicion, a ruler who would devour his own children to feed his paranoia. The courts of Europe, which had previously looked at Henry with a mixture of annoyance and respect, now looked at him with revulsion. The English terror had begun. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador in London, was a man who rarely felt sympathy for the English. He had spent years plotting against Anne Boleyn, yet even Chapuis was stunned by the efficiency of the Purge. In his dispatches to Emperor Charles V, he noted the grim irony. The very men who had helped Henry break with Rome and install Anne Boleyn were the first to be fed to the machine they had helped to build. Chapuis saw the executions not as justice, but as a clearing of the board. He understood that Brereton's death in particular was a political masterstroke by Cromwell, disguised as a moral crusade. The international fallout had real consequences. England became a pariah state. The diplomatic trust that is essential for alliances evaporated. If Henry could not be trusted to keep his best friends alive, how could he be trusted to honor a treaty? The execution of the minions isolated England, pushing it further into the defensive fortress mentality that would characterize the later years of Henry's reign. Domestically, the death of these men fundamentally altered the legal landscape of England. We must look at the legal concept of constructive treason. Before 1536, treason was generally understood as an overt act, raising an army, plotting to kill the king, or counterfeiting coin. The trial of Weston and Brereton expanded this definition into the realm of the mind. Francis Weston died because of words. His statement, "I love one in your house better than them both," was not an act of violence. It was not a plot. It was a sentiment. By executing him for this, the Crown established a terrifying precedent that intent inferred from loose speech was equal to action. This shift created a culture of silence. In the taverns of London and the great halls of the nobility, men stopped talking. The treason of words meant that a joke told in a drunken stupor could lead to Tower Hill. The Privy Council began to receive a flood of denunciations. Neighbors reported neighbors. Servants reported masters. The execution of the king's favorites proved that immunity did not exist, and therefore the only safety lay in being the first to accuse. The psychological impact on the survivors of the Privy Chamber was profound. Consider the case of Sir Thomas Heneage or Sir Anthony Denny, men who rose to take the places of Weston and Norris. They served the king, but they did not love him in the way the old circle had. They served him with fear. The atmosphere of the Privy Chamber changed from a locker room of boon companions to a silent, efficient office of state. The laughter died with Weston. This loss of intimacy had a catastrophic effect on Henry VIII himself. Historians often focus on Henry's physical decline, the ulcers, the obesity, but his emotional decline was accelerated by the events of May 15th, 36. By killing Weston, Henry killed his own youth. Weston was the mirror that reflected a young, athletic, desirable Henry back at himself. When Henry looked at Weston, he saw the man he used to be. By destroying the mirror, Henry was forced to confront the reality of his own aging, rotting body. After 1536, Henry became increasingly solitary. He no longer had a circle of equals. He had servants and he had victims. The tyrant of the 1540s, the man who executed Cromwell, the man who burned heretics and papists on the same day, was born in the vacuum left by the men he killed in 1536. He had taught himself that human connection was a weakness and that betrayal was inevitable. The story of Sir William Brereton leaves a different but equally heavy legacy. His death marked the end of the medieval style of local governance. Brereton was a warlord. He ruled Cheshire through personal charisma, violence, and patronage. He was a king in his own corner of the world. His execution was a signal from the center to the periphery. The days of the overmighty subject were over. Thomas Cromwell used Brereton's death to force through the Acts of Union with Wales. He reorganized the Council of the North. He standardized the justice system. In a very real sense, the modern bureaucratic state of Great Britain was built on the grave of William Brereton. The centralized power of London, which we take for granted today, was established by destroying the local power brokers who stood in its way. Brereton was the human cost of efficiency. We have told the story of the fall. We have looked at the men, the trial, and the aftermath, but there is one final layer to this tragedy. We must look at the women who were left behind, the wives, the mothers, and the daughters who had to navigate the wreckage. Their story is often ignored, but it is in their survival that the true cost of Henry's tyranny is measured. History often ends the story with the political fallout and the king's psychological decline, but this ignores the immediate crushing reality faced by the survivors. The axe severed heads, but the laws of attainder threatened to sever the livelihoods of the widows and mothers left in the wreckage. The true cost of the king's paranoia is found not just in the graves of the dead, but in the desperate, often silent struggle of their families to claw their way back from social and economic oblivion. The execution of the patriarch was a nuclear event for a Tudor household, and we must look at the women who had to navigate the radioactive fallout. The axe that fell on Tower Hill severed more than just heads. It severed the economic and social lifelines of the families left behind. In the 16th century, the execution of a patriarch or a firstborn son was a nuclear event for a household. It brought with it the terrifying specter of attainder. To understand the nightmare faced by the women of the Weston and Brereton families, We must understand attainder. Under Tudor law, a man convicted of treason did not just lose his life, he lost his legal personhood retroactively. His blood was considered corrupt. This meant he could not own property, and more importantly, he could not pass property down to his heirs. The chain of inheritance was broken. The crown confiscated everything. For Anne Pickering, the young widow of Sir Francis Weston, this was the reality she woke up to on May 18th, 1536. She was 25 years old, her husband was a convicted traitor, and her son Henry was legally a non-person who could inherit nothing. The survival of Anne Pickering is a study in Tudor pragmatism. She did not retreat into a convent. She did not flee to the continent. She understood that in a world ruled by men, her only safety lay in securing a new protector. She was still an heiress in her own right, and despite the stigma of her husband's treason, she was valuable. Within a respectable but short period, Anne remarried. She did not marry a nobody. She married Sir Henry VIII, a rising star in the court, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and a man trusted by Henry VIII. This is the breathtaking cynicism of the era. The widow of the man executed by the king married another of the king's servants, essentially stepping right back into the lion's den. Anne Pickering's life with Knivet took her back to the very center of power. She did not hide. She returned to court. One can only imagine the whispers as she walked the corridors of Hampton Court. Did she look at the king and see her first husband's murderer? Did the king look at her and remember the golden boy? We have no record of these interactions, but her presence proves that the survivors of 1536 learned to wear masks of iron. She eventually died in 1582, having outlived Henry VIII by decades, a quiet victor in the game of survival. But the most tragic figure in the Weston household was not the wife, but the mother. Lady Margaret Weston is often a footnote, but her story is a psychological horror. Lady Margaret had served Catherine of Aragon for years. She had then served Anne Boleyn. She was a fixture of the royal household. When her son was arrested, she watched the machine she had served turn on her own flesh and blood. Remarkably, Lady Weston did not leave the court after her son's execution. She continued to serve. She became a lady-in-waiting to Jane Seymour, the very woman whose rise had necessitated her son's death. This was not a lack of maternal love. It was a necessity. The Westons had to prove their loyalty. If they had withdrawn, showing anger or grief, they might have been next. So Lady Weston pinned on her velvet sleeves, lowered her head, and served the king who had killed her boy. It was a performance of loyalty that must have cost her a piece of her soul every single day. The struggle for the Brereton family in Cheshire was less about court politics and more about a desperate ground war for land. Sir William Brereton had been a tycoon. His portfolio of land, stewardships, and leases was vast and complex. When he was attainted, the vultures descended. Cromwell's agents swarmed into Cheshire and North Wales, seizing titles and rewriting contracts. Elizabeth Brereton, his widow, found herself under siege. She was the daughter of the Earl of Worcester, a woman of high blood, but even she struggled to hold back the tide. We see in the legal records of the time a flurry of lawsuits. Neighbors who had been terrified of William Brereton while he was alive suddenly found the courage to sue his widow for stolen land. The local gentry, repressed for decades by Brereton's iron fist, took their revenge on his wife and children. Elizabeth fought back. She used her family connections to secure some of the leases, but the great Brereton empire was shattered. The crown absorbed the most valuable assets. The lesson here was clear. The king gives and the king takes away. There is no such thing as private property when treason is involved. However, the story of these families does not end in ruin. It ends in restoration. The concept of restoration in blood is crucial to the English aristocracy. It is the process by which the crown forgives the sins of the father and allows the son to inherit. It is the state admitting, without actually apologizing, that the punishment has gone on long enough. Henry Weston, the son of the executed Francis, had to wait. He grew up in the shadow of the scaffold. He was the traitor's son. But time heals political wounds, especially when the king dies. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the atmosphere changed. The boy King Edward VI took the throne, followed by Mary I and finally Elizabeth I. It was under these later Tudors that the Weston family clawed their way back. In 1549, the prohibition was lifted. Henry Weston was restored in blood. He was allowed to inherit Sutton Place. He was allowed to be a citizen. And then history produced one of its great ironies. Sir Henry Weston, the son of the man who supposedly slept with Anne Boleyn, became a Knight of the Bath at the coronation of Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter. He served her as a sheriff and a member of Parliament. Consider the dynamic. Queen Elizabeth I was a woman who revered the memory of her mother, Anne Boleyn. She knew the names of the men who had died with her. She knew Francis Weston was one of them, yet she welcomed his son. Did they ever speak of it? Did Elizabeth look at Henry Weston and see the ghost of the circle that had been destroyed? We do not know. But the fact that Henry Weston flourished under Elizabeth suggests a silent understanding. They were both children of 1536. They were both orphans of the same catastrophe. The son of the lover and the daughter of the adulteress found a way to coexist and govern England together. The physical legacy of these men also tells a story of erasure and endurance. If you go to the Tower of London today, you can enter the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. It is a small, polite church. Under the altar lies the dust of queens and saints. But somewhere in that nave lies the mixed dust of Weston and Brereton. There is no individual marker for them. They were denied the stone effigies and brass plaques that men of their status would normally expect. Their punishment was anonymity, but they survived in the architecture they left behind. Sutton Place in Surrey is the ghost of Francis Weston. It is one of the earliest unfortified manor houses in England. It has no moat, no keep. It was built for peace and pleasure. It was built by Sir Richard Weston for his son Francis to inherit. The terracotta ornaments on the walls feature tunnies, barrels, a pun on the Weston name, Weston. When you walk through the halls of Sutton Place, you are walking through the house that Francis Weston was supposed to grow old in. It is a house frozen in potential. It represents the Renaissance future that was stolen from him. In Cheshire, the Brereton legacy is harder to find, but it is there in the DNA of the region. The administrative structures that replaced his personal rule, the justices of the peace, the standardized courts, are the bedrock of local government. Brereton was the last of the medieval warlords. His death paved the way for the rule of law. He was the chaos that had to be removed for order to flourish. Why then, after nearly 500 years, does the story of these two men still grip us? It is because they represent the two great archetypes of political failure. Weston represents the failure of charm. He believed that because he was loved, he was safe. He believed that personality could triumph over politics. He was the golden boy who didn't realize that gold is soft and easily melted. He reminds us that being the life of the party is a dangerous profession when the host is a psychopath. Brereton represents the failure of force. He believed that because he was useful and feared, he was safe. He believed that the state needed him too much to kill him. He was the strong man who didn't realize that the state will always eventually crush independent power. he reminds us that no one is too big to fall. In the final analysis, Francis Weston and William Brereton were not villains. They were not heroes. They were men of their time swimming in waters that were too deep and too cold for them. They were pulled under by the wake of the great ship that was Henry VIII's ego. But they deserve to be more than footnotes. They deserve to be remembered not just as the other men in the Anne Boleyn saga, but as human beings who face the ultimate terror with a complexity that defies the dry ink of the indictment. Weston's final debt list, worrying about his soul and his creditors. Brereton's final defiance, asking the crowd to judge the best. These are the moments where the history breathes. The tragedy of 1536 was a tragedy of silence. The king silenced his wife. He silenced his friends. He silenced his conscience. But history has a way of breaking the silence. By piecing together the fragments, the letters, the debts, the lost manors, the grieving widows, we can give these men the hearing they were denied in Westminster Hall. They were the king's friends, and that was their crime.